Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Talent Gap Fireside Chat, where we talk about causes of and solutions to the talent gap. I'm your host, Pete Strauss, and joining me today is Pete Hay. He's the CEO over at Arbiter. Welcome, Pete.
Thanks so much, Pete. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for being here, and great name that you have there. So would you say, could you give our audience a little background on your career thus far?
Sure. So I've followed kind of a non-traditional career. Depending on how you count it, I'm on either my third or fourth career at this point. I went to college to study business, and I think most would say that didn't take. And so I moved on, joined the Navy, enlisted. I was originally a nuclear chemist. I went to the USS Seawolf and then cross-rated to cryptologic technician network, where I was up in Fort Meade for a couple of years. And then I got out and taught for several years, teaching JCAC down in Pensacola, the Joint Cyber Analysis course, caught commercial instruction all over the world, which was tons of fun. Helped found a company called Resolvin with a couple of friends of mine, and actually a former student of mine was the CEO there, Sean Donnelly. We were acquired by a company called SimSpace Cyber Range Company. And eventually I left to found Arbiter. So not exactly you go to college, get a degree in the thing you want to do, and then do that thing for, 30 to 40 years path that I think a lot of people have in mind for a career.
Yeah, that's great to hear, the non-traditional path that you've had. And I've long been an advocate for hiring folks that have those non-traditional paths that didn't follow the quote unquote blueprint. I think there's a lot of overlooked, underappreciated talent out there, basically. And I know you have some thoughts on that. We actually connected, I think, initially because I saw that you were hiring junior folks, and that seems to be such a rare thing in our field. But would you say that the talent gap is a real thing? And if so, what would you say it looks like?
So I think there's two sides to this argument, and the controversial hot take of mine is that the talent gap is really not real. It's made up. And that's not to say now we have to back off and add a dose of reality to that, which is obviously there are unfilled positions. Depending on the numbers you look at, there's somewhere between 2.7 and 4.4 million open cybersecurity or InfoSec positions. So that's real. There's no question that there are positions open and unfilled. Whether or not there's actually a talent gap, I would argue we don't know. And the reason is what we were seeing when it comes to hiring. Look, we don't treat cybersecurity like so many other career fields. In my time in the military, we had a qualification path where you went from what was jokingly called a nub or a non-usable body. And I know that terminology has been scrubbed from the lexicon, but when I was when you were unqualified, you were not useful. You couldn't do a thing. And so when you got to the boat, the first thing they did is they're like, let's get you useful. Let's teach you a thing that you can do. I don't understand why that is missing in cybersecurity. The concept of, we as the employer can quantify a task that has an impact on our business operations, whether that be revenue generation or risk mitigation or what have you, that is appropriate for a person who has entry-level skills to do. That's incumbent on the business to do that. You can't force the junior person to create that or quantify that or what have you. And I think we still very much treat cybersecurity like an artisanal business or like a bespoke business, that we're still handcrafting airplanes from scratch by one master mechanic, a master craftsman who's building everything from cradle to grave. That's not modern, right? And it's very strange that this cutting edge industry is somehow also operating like a cottage industry at the same time. So that's one of my frustrations with it.
Yeah, for sure. I think the argument I generally hear is that security is not an entry-level field, and here's why. It's because you need to understand the underlying technology that you're looking to secure. So, and I think a lot of the hiring teams struggle to figure out what those tasks are that they can actually delegate to that junior entry-level person without feeling like they're risking the security of their organization. Any thoughts on those?
I both agree and disagree. I've seen Ira Winkler post on this all the time, that you can't be a cybersecurity expert without with skipping all the steps. He posts that meme pretty regularly. Respectfully, I disagree. And what I mean by that is, I think there are too many things bundled into that base knowledge. I don't think that you can just take a person and say, congratulations, you're now a cybersecurity engineer, like a knighthood. You just bestow it upon them and off they go, right? By some kind of, divine proclamation. But people who are in computer science, for example, if you can use Python and pandas to do data science, you can do so many of the functions that are associated with cybersecurity. And I understand there's specific knowledge associated with that. But does that mean that you couldn't put two people together and be a force multiplier? That a person who is, and by the way, this is the business side of things, a much less expensive employee who could get tasking from a more senior, seasoned cybersecurity expert to do something like, hey, I need you to aggregate this type of query, demonstrate for me the results in a dashboard. I want you to build me a dashboard that looks like that. Well, to be honest, building a dashboard in Elastic is only a very small portion of that is the cybersecurity challenge. The only piece is knowing which, event codes or sysmon logs or event IDs or whatever are going into that. That's the only cybersecurity. The rest is all a data science challenge. And yet there are hundreds of thousands of people with degrees in data science that are unable to work in cybersecurity. And that disconnect is very confusing to me. It seems to me that instead of trying to go out and hire another cybersecurity expert at $160,000 a year and then have them build dashboards, go hire a data scientist, a fledgling data scientist who comes in as an entry-level position between $65,000 and $85,000 a year. You'd have 2 or 3 of those people for less than bringing on a new cybersecurity engineer. And, to my mind, that's the modern, assembly line approach of saying, you're going to get exposure to this space. You're going to bring some skills and expertise. Someone is going to be there to kind of bring you along and give you tasking and break that up into what Sean used to call digestible chunks. My co-founder, he always liked saying, like these small bite-sized pieces. And once you've done that, now you're approaching this from a business standpoint. And I think it's ironic that I didn't enjoy the business side of my degree program. So I wanted to do something with my hands. And now I've come all the way full circle back to where I'm saying, hey, we can make a business case argument to improve our processes surrounding cybersecurity, to make it more accessible, to close the skills gap, to bring people in and to reduce overall labor costs. And instead, we're looking for people with all these qualifications, can do all these things, and are kind of, in my mind, a Swiss Army knife. And as I look at some of these really long job recs, all I see is those really ridiculously huge. Have you ever seen one of the, been like at a knife store and seen the Swiss Army knife that's a foot wide, that's got, 400 different adapters? And the thing is, first of all, it's a curio, because you're not going to use it that for all those things. You're only going to use 2 or 3 of them. And then, of course, it costs you $4,000 when in reality you could have gone to Harbor Freight and gotten the knife and the scissors and the tweezers that you actually wanted for a fraction the cost. And I guess that's my point around hiring, is that we're approaching it from this one size must fit everything approach. That's where you end up overpaying for people. And then the crazy part, they're not happy. Like if you are this special, incredible unicorn and they're like, anyway, we're going to hit you to this plow, get to plowing. Like, no unicorn is happy doing that. So, some might, but I think you get my point.
Yeah, for sure. Now, one issue I guess that I see a lot is, especially in this economic environment or hiring environment, there's a lot of teams that they don't have as much budget as they want. They don't have as much head count as they want. And so they're kind of relegated to hiring, I always say reactively, because basically they have an open spot on their team. They have a list of skills that they need to plug into that team where there's gaps on, the other team members, skill set plates. And so basically the thought there is, well, I can't afford to hire somebody more junior. We simply don't have the manpower, the man hours to train this person up. We just need somebody that's plug and play and can, quote unquote, hit the ground running, as everybody says. Do you see any solution to that? Like, in my experience, there's just no market need for the juniors. It's everybody says, okay, well, that's great in theory to hire the juniors, but in practice, I have this really senior skill set that I'm lacking on my team, and there's nothing I can do about it. I have to fill that.
I think this is a fair point that you raise. But the question that I would ask is, what skill? And I've heard this argument before. And most of the time when you start getting into the specifics and really demanding a very specific answer of quantify the skill that your organization lacks, and then we will devise a plan to go fill that talent gap. If it's just one senior skill that you're lacking, then the correct way to handle that is to contract that out. Because if you have to go hire someone extremely senior or extremely expensive, it may very well be that your approach is, from a business perspective, an unsuccessful approach, meaning there is a certain cost associated with certain skills. And what I would really ask is, what percentage of the day-to-day work of this person you want to go acquire is that skill? And that's the question that I ask all the time. Is the reality is every SOC that I've ever seen they have their requirements written out, but the reality is there are 2 or 3. In fact, I saw a TikTok yesterday that said it was, like the real interview questions that you should be asking. And the one that made me laugh the most was just point at the part of your resume that's a lie. We know you're lying. We're not mad, but there are a couple of things we can't flex on. And I laughed, and then I paused and I said, well, wait a minute. Then why do you have the other stuff on the resume? Why do you have the other requirements? It's not actually the resume's fault. I mean, it is. Obviously, that person's lying. But it's actually the job rec's fault. If there are certain things that you cannot do without in this job, then that should be the whole job requirement. If you put all the sprinkles, all the edge cases, whatever, if you hire for edge cases, you run the risk of finding somebody who's really talented at this edge case and excited about doing it, and then spends 4% of their time doing it. You need to hire for the 80%. And so my opinion, bringing back to your original question, is, well, if there's no call for these junior people, I think there are 2 major challenges with it. First is that cybersecurity is very rarely treated the same as other business units. A friend of mine was offered a director position at a company a while back, and he asked me for advice on it. I said, the question you want to ask in the interview process is, what does being a director mean for your company? Does it mean that I have my own budget and a series of objectives, and then I apply that budget to achieve those directives in the most efficient and effective manner I devise? Or am I really just a middle manager who is kind of continuing the vision that comes from someone else, or may just be continuing what has always been done? Because who knows if that's even a vision that was, a unified plan put together. If that's just, I don't know, that's what was happening when I got here. That's what will be happening when I leave. I think cybersecurity very commonly is not treated the same way. There's this idea of like, a SOC should have these things. It should have these roles. It should have these people, what have you. And, we need this skill set. Why? Have we actually sat down and done a business analysis on it and said, what percentage of your time is actually going to these different skills that this company is currently paying you for? If you think about every line item on a resume should be treated as a certain number of dollars. Like, it cost them time and effort to get that experience. It has value to a business. And so that person's getting paid for what they're capable of. Now the question is it necessary? Or is it just kind of a remnant that has lived on as a requirement in our HR system because it's never been, kind of critically examined? I suspect that you'll find that part of the reason we don't bring in junior people is because no one's ever said, well, do I really need 3 mid-level host analysts? Could I get away with 1 good one and then 7 junior ones? And that would actually bring down my labor costs and have the opportunity to kind of cast a broad net and find some people who are, autodidacts or high aptitude, people who have a real passion for this. and then they come along and they grow, and we have the opportunity to kind of develop from within. So I just don't know that it's always. It sounds like I'm saying people aren't approaching this intentionally. What I mean is I don't know that the machinery of business is prepared to approach it that way. You'll have issues with HR, and HR has a legitimate business purpose to reduce risk to a company. But does that necessarily mean that they care about helping the InfoSec team manage their budget? Well, no, that's not their responsibility. Their responsibility is reduce risk. And so, those two things have to be balanced against each other. And so sometimes like just the bureaucracy of business can stand in the way of those assessments and decisions and approaches to how you do hiring. And yeah. I think there's a valid point in saying it is lower risk to hire somebody who has a big resume, is more expensive. Like it's absolutely lower risk. With the heavy asterisk of it's lower risk to your company in terms of performance, but it's more expensive and there's a risk associated with that. It means that you'll have people at different stages of the career. I think there's a very serious diversity comment about, when you start adding experience requirements, the workforce was less diverse in the last generation than it is in this generation. And so, you don't get the opportunity to have more diverse workforce when you do those sorts of things as well.
Yeah, all great points. And I think about how you mentioned when you hire a bunch of junior folks like that, you're kind of hiring for high potential individuals. And eventually, if you're able to retain those folks, their high potential will be realized if you can hang on to them long enough. And it's a way to essentially get really, really high performers for a fraction of what they're going to cost at some point in the future in their career. And you get to take advantage of them, when they're right. Take advantage probably isn't the right terminology.
We start saying uncomfortable phrases now, right? We start saying things like, oh, what a great opportunity. You get them while they're cheap. And, it is true. There is a business aspect to this where, there's a component of, if you're effective in quantifying the skills that you need and can fill that from non-traditional sources, you may very well realize a very real cost savings. Okay, now how do we make sure that's ethical? Yes, and this is my second piece: is cybersecurity does not have a career progression plan for people. It's like an art. You're an artist. It's an artisanal industry. We're crafting artisanal incident reports. With handmade parchment that we put together, but. We kind of treat it like that. How do you go from being a junior analyst to a mid-level analyst to a senior analyst? Do you progress from SOC to incident response to red team? Everybody wants to be a red teamer for some reason. I don't know. And so, what does that career progression inside cybersecurity look like? And the way that a lot of companies really heavily stratified. There's, essentially interns and SMEs and then managers, and there's really not a lot in between. That's where it gets, I would argue, you run the risk of being perceived as unethical, because if you get them while they're cheap and then there's no path for them to become better compensated, even as their skills grow, even as their value to the corporation grows, if there's no path to compensation, well, that's an imbalanced relationship, and that's not healthy. And so you get unhappy people, you get turnover, you get departures, and you're right back to having an empty spot. And I do believe that this is the other part of that cybersecurity skills gap, is if the corporation doesn't have a plan how you bring in those junior people and then nurture their careers internally, that's where your second risk. And this is, again, I think this is something that it's very easy for HR to overlook this risk, but that departure is just as bad as empty positions. And in fact, in many ways, a person leaving is very bad for the company, because there's institutional knowledge that's lost. There's the cost of filling. I saw a Gartner report that said 6 to 9 months to fill an empty job rec in InfoSec right now. So there's a real risk in terms of, and then you add to it that not only is there an empty position, but now that work is being done by a smaller team. And so the likelihood that someone on that team leaves because of burnout or what have you goes up as well. So, it's challenging, but I do believe that bringing in junior people and helping them progress through their career inside your company is the correct and ethical way of making sure that you are basically making all the right business decisions. And it's very, I tell you what, I'll give you a story. I watched a person at a company I was associated with some time ago who was at a director level. Excuse me, they were senior manager and basically deserved a promotion to director. And the cost was going to be 10%, 15% raise. And the company looked at it and said, I don't know, you've been with us long enough for that promotion. So naturally the person departed, right? And, it's not a shocking decision for them to depart. And they were functionally running a department all by themselves. They were incredibly effective. Everybody loved them. And so then they had to go out and hire someone else. And then instead of hiring a director, they hired a VP for that position. Well, that salary differential was almost double what the senior manager was making, and about 50% on top of what they would have made as a director. That VP viewed their role as setting policy, not so much doing the hands-on work. So then they hired 3 additional people. And so the cost of not giving a person a 15% raise was actually almost 6 times their salary, because they replaced one person with an actual whole department, basically. And that's where I come into, like, obviously that was a mistake, right? In hindsight, it's incredibly clear that was a huge mistake. And I think some of it was we didn't recognize all of the different things being held down by that person. Overall satisfaction with the job, the work being done by that department went down after that person's departure, even with almost 5 people replacing them. And so I think it goes back to the point is like, and then all the institutional knowledge that departed and the relationships departed and all of those sorts of things. So it's very easy to get fixated on this person has been with us so long, and yeah, they might be worthy of an extra 15%, but gosh, that is 15%. But then we don't see the costs, the follow-on costs after that departure. And I think that's the point that I'm really trying to make here, is that without that career progression, taking a person from junior through mid-level into senior leadership, and at least having a path for it and an openness and kind of like an honest assessment of their performance, without that, I mean, the risk exposure to your company is much higher than I think companies' assessment processes are designed to detect.
Yeah, and I've worked with plenty of companies where there is somebody in contention for a promotion, but then that person doesn't even know it. There's no communication, and there was no expectation setting in the beginning. Like, look, if you manage to get this particular business outcome for the company, at that point we'll start considering you for that next level. If that had been said early on and that person hit that watermark, they would start asking, okay, well, so is this in the works or what? So I think all of that starts very early. And yeah, if there's any way that you can formalize these promotion pathways, and in some cases for a different type of person, maybe they're more interested in cross training with a different department, and they don't need the money or the title increase. There's so many things you can do to retain people over the long term that aren't just throwing more money at the problem. And I stress that all the time. And I think it all begins in the recruiting process early on. When you talk to one of those candidates and you really want to dig into their motivators and understand what gets them out of bed in the morning. It could be anything, and every person is different. Some people are very money motivated, in which case, yeah, you're going to need to show them a direct path to where they want to be, or title motivated is common in consulting. But there's so many things you can do without necessarily having all of this stuff in place already too. A lot of the best hiring managers I've worked with over the years, they may be working at a startup or something where none of these things are set in stone. There's no job title hierarchy where they know exactly where this person is going to go next. But as long as they're keeping close to that employee and understanding where their head's at, I think that's where a lot of the career planning things kind of fall through the cracks. There's a breakdown of trust between the hiring manager and the person being managed. And to your point from earlier, if you get that one person to leave, they might be the cultural linchpin for that whole team, or in some cases the whole company if it's small enough. I've seen where one person will leave, and I've been on teams where one person left and then another person left, and then it just snowballed. And then before long, that whole team was gone. How do you think companies don't see that sort of thing coming? It would seem that if you were doing even basic due diligence, you would understand that there's some unhappiness there.
Oh, well, let me be vulnerable for a moment then. Being a CEO is a strange thing, because it's such a weird experience. You have to, there's this weird combination of work ethic, arrogance, Pollyanna optimism, et cetera, that allows a business to come into existence. And it's something that I've been involved in startups before, but when you're the CEO, it's a very different experience. And so I say that to say, I think that as success comes, it's very easy to now say, yes, I am the reason. And it's very easy to kind of fall into the, the cult of your own personality, or however you want to describe that. And so there have been times when I've seen people depart and it was viewed as a betrayal. I've seen people depart and it was seen as a massive surprise. Why would they ever leave us? And you said, some people are money, but everybody's money motivated. Of course they're money motivated. And I think there's this kind of weird avoidance of the topic in business. And I suspect it benefits very large corporations, that cultural taboo of speaking about compensation. But the reality is, there are few things on the planet that more appropriately express your appreciation of someone than saying, 1 hour of your time is worth this many of my dollars. Like, you want to talk about appreciation, I can throw you all the pizza parties on the planet or have a happy hour to my heart's content. But there are few things on the planet more than saying, Pete, when I hired you, I thought an hour of your time would be worth this plus a profit margin to this company. And I was wrong. You are worth so much more than I was originally paying you, and I'd like to give you a raise. You want to keep employees happy, say those things to them. By the way, there's a whole accountability side of that that's really difficult from a business standpoint to say, you are generating revenues, you're impacting our corporate efficiency to this point. To be able to actually quantify that for an employee, there's a lot that goes into that, as you know. But that's an important thing. And you can tell me, oh, we're a family here. And it's one of those things that always drives me nuts. I'm like, some people don't have great families. I don't know if that's necessarily what you want to tie this corporate culture to. Family's complicated. I said, we're a team. And I like that better because, I've played on sports teams in the past where we all got along great and it was like a family. I've played on sports teams where none of us liked each other, but we could work together. And I've played on very dysfunctional sports teams. So I like team because I think it's basically the social construct that's large enough to hold all that. But so I think there's this blind spot of happiness, or why would a person not be happy? I'm great, so of course people would be happy to work with me. I think there's those blind spots can be tied to greed. I think it's a really, really easy thing. We talked about this a lot internally. Is there's this terrible thing that happens when you have employees who are working for you, and at 40 hours a week, here's your profit margin, blah blah blah. And then there's this terrible realization that you make as a CEO when a deadline comes up and people work for more hours, and you're like, oh, wow, last week was really profitable because we all worked for 45 hours a week. And that's a hideous, horrible temptation to say oh, we were more profitable because I either didn't pay them as much as usual, or we worked more hours or whatever. And so as a, kind of treating the business as its own thing. From a business perspective, overworking and underpaying people is good for the bottom line. So of course, in the short term, right. But the problem is the metrics is that, essentially whatever you are measuring will dictate your behavior. So if what you're measuring is bottom line, then the original decision, back to my example of not giving that person a raise, there was a 15% savings, and that person was filling 4 roles. So, we're saving tons of money by having this person here. That's short-sighted, just like you said. But if you don't have the metrics, if you don't have the self-examination, when we were putting together our company ethos, we were trying to decide, what is kind of our approach to things. And we decided on humble, ethical, and professional as our 3 kind of core principles as the company. And my thought on that is if you're, first of all, humble about yourself, it means you're unafraid of examining yourself. And so if somebody comes to you and like, hey, I'm not happy with you, you're grateful for that conversation. Because my goal is not to make things difficult on people around me, despite what it may look like at times, because I'm not always great at it. But if I'm humble and approachable about it, that's a big step on improving that culture. And then ethical is like that self-examination as well. It's like, I'm not just going to be humble. I'm going to be ethical about this, because that's, I think, how you avoid some getting taken advantage of. Humble people can sometimes get overworked. And part of that ethics cuts both ways is, nope, I'm humble, but my work has value and what I do has impact and import. And so, I'm going to use my agency to respect all of that. And then, the combination of those things, it gets you a professional. That's my thought. And a big part of that for me is like the self-examination, the examining your own business, making sure you're being, accountable, kind, and providing compensation. Like money is such an important part of that conversation that, if 2 employees are talking to each other and one of them like, hey, Pete, I'm disgruntled because, employee A is getting paid more than me. And I think I'm doing work that's as good as theirs. The conversation should not be, why are you talking about that? The conversation should be, is that accurate? And then we have difficult conversations kindly, because if either side, if they're right, then I need to be ethical about that. If they're wrong, I need to have that tough conversation kindly. And the tough conversation goes both ways. So I think I took a rabbit trail on answering your question on how does this happen, but I think it happens completely unintentionally, where either one of 3 things can happen, where a CEO is essentially in that mentality of everything's great because I'm awesome and look what we've built. And that can lead to blind spots. And that's why humility is one of our goals. The second one is, gosh, we make a lot more money when people work more than 40 hours a week. And or when we underpay employees for the work that they're doing, for the quality work that they're doing. That's where ethics come in. That there's a quote from Warren Buffett in the biography written about him called Snowball, where he says, it is better to buy a great company for a good price than it is to buy a good company for a great price. And he talks about Berkshire Hathaway being the time that he fell for a great price and bought them. And the reason he still owns them is because it was not a great decision. And so the best way to handle that was to bundle all his businesses together and so on and so forth. But I think of it the same way when it comes to employees. I would rather pay a great employee a wage that is fair for what they earn than pay a good employee a wage that's good for me. I think you get a better end product out of the former rather than the latter. And so ethics, I think, is the answer. And I think, again, like, I don't think anybody's out there steepling their hands like Mr. Burns trying to do that. They're doing their role. They're looking at the bottom line, or they're examining the metrics that they have. But I think those metrics are short-sighted.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't necessarily see anything wrong with focusing on making money for the company. I mean, at the end of the day, if it's not a nonprofit, that's the purpose of the company, to maximize shareholder value. But I suppose for me, the issue I see that seems to come up, it's something I've noticed, and I don't know what's really causing this, but we kind of touched on it earlier. The idea that let's focus on cutting costs today, because we kind of got to make our numbers look good. We have to run lean right now. Versus looking at the medium to long term, where perhaps if we're overworking our already lean team, they might all leave, but that's a future unknown. So I almost see it kind of like as a calculated risk that a lot of companies will take, but I think it's a bad calculation. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on the short-term versus long-term thing?
I think we're seeing it play out very publicly in front of us with the whole Boeing situation. You're seeing quotes from the former leadership at McDonnell Douglas who came in. I saw the CFO had some kind of quote, if the allegation is that the McDonnell Douglas people came in and changed the culture at Boeing, it's true. That's what we were supposed to do. We were supposed to run this like a business, not like an engineering firm. And that's not a verbatim quote, but it's darned close. And it's exactly what we're talking about. He's the CFO. His job is to manage the bottom line. And so the choices that they made to run like a business, not like an engineering firm, made perfect sense to a CFO. But what happens is the engineers got uninvolved, got removed from some of those decision-making points. And what happens? Safety suffered. And ultimately, the company will suffer far more. And so I think the key is that when you pay attention too much to any one metric or when you give it too much weight, that's where you run the risk. And I think, again, back to that's why we picked ethics and humility, is that, humility is getting that input from others, and the ethics is making sure that we're weighing all of these different considerations in a manner that, has like long-term stability, both for the company and for the public. Because like you said, our responsibility is to our shareholders, but it's not to our shareholders today. It's not to our shareholders, this week. It's to our shareholders long-term. And I think that's that long-term build a healthy foundation is not, not social media fun. It's difficult to convince people that it is a good idea to go steady and consistent and, to do the hard work up front and those sorts of things, and then enjoy the benefits. And for a long time, I've talked about this term that I jokingly call punctuated laziness, pivoting off of punctuated equilibrium. But punctuated laziness is you're so lazy, you're willing to work like a banshee today so that tomorrow isn't awful. And it's stealing from a quote that my grandfather used to say, is there's a fine line between efficiency and laziness. And as long as you're close to the line, people will think you're smart. And I think that's what's missing, is the kind of the humility of saying, is this decision that it might be brilliant, right? If we get rid of this engineering team or we scrap some of those safety concerns, we could add whole percentage points to our bottom line as a company, and that's great for our shareholders. But now we're going to sit down with the engineers and they're going to tell us that it's a bad idea, and we're going to weigh this out. We're going to come up with a metric that actually expresses the increase in risk against the value. And then, of course, our safety and reputation for our business. Because I'll tell you right now, I'm going to get on a plane on Monday, and if it's a Boeing, I'm going to move out of the exit row. That is probably not how Boeing wants to be thought of in the public eye right now. And that has a real impact on their bottom line beyond just whether or not they could save a couple of percentage points in materials on how they manufactured those doors.
Yeah, and steady, iterative progress is not as sexy as being on the latest rocket ship. So, I see that often because I work with a ton of startups, of all sizes, well, in startup terms anyway. But, I've seen what can happen when you have a company that has kind of a growth at all costs mindset, and it's about, maximizing those profits in the short term. My frame of reference is generally consulting firms. And so what I've seen consulting firms do is they'll sell as much work as they possibly can, and then try and figure out the delivery aspect of it on the back end. But it's always a game of catch up. So the auditors in some cases, or, assessors or pen testers or whomever, they're always going to be, their schedules are going to be packed, booked out for months. Their deadlines are very short. They're working long hours. And, that makes sense in the short term. You're maximizing profit and you're running a lean team and things like that. But over time, you start to see these negative externalities where people leave, and then maybe people leave in droves, or maybe you don't have the right support system in place for those folks to work all those hours. If they have a lot of manual processes and they don't have the support staff to manage projects, and they're doing a lot of the administrative tasks, that they're being overloaded with work that isn't core to their job function. So how do you, as an executive yourself, how do you streamline these things to make sure that you have the appropriate level of folks that are revenue generating versus, the support functions?
So, this is a great question. And I don't know that I have been successful enough to tell you that my approach works. But I do say that I'm comfortable in telling you what it is. My approach is very much about people. And when it comes to companies, they have a tendency to grow organically. And it's really funny to say this, but I got to see this because of some of my early pen testing. And you would see how, especially SMBs, small and mid-sized businesses, their networks would be these hideous abominations. And it was, again, there's no Mr. Burns out there like, excellent, no one will be able to, we're going to have an IT staff of 1,000. Well, it's not like that. It's organic. It's, oh no, we just hit our 55th person and our AP isn't doing a good job, or whatever. Buy another device. Okay, where are we going to attach it? There. Why? Because it's expedient. And I think expediency is probably the most frightening word in business. Is so many decisions, especially in startups, have to be made for expediency. You have to say, okay, today we're doing this. We actually just made the decision. I had been using Trello to track some things and Jira for most of our tasks. And Rachel is the person that I think everybody at the company has slowly come to terms with the fact that we all work for her. She came to me and said, hey, I really think we should put all this in Jira because there's better accountability and, we can tag people across and then we're standardizing, et cetera. And I didn't want to do it because Trello was super convenient for me and I was really comfortable with it. And it's all part of the Atlassian suite. So of course I immediately did what she told me anyway, even though it wasn't my favorite. And the reality is because she's looking ahead. And there's a reason that I hired Rachel is because she's exceptional at what she does. And so if I'm going to overrule Rachel for expediency, there had better be a darned good reason why I'm doing it. But if she comes to me and tells me this is the best approach, that's her area of expertise. I'm going to trust her on that. And now, if I can't afford it, well, then that's a different problem, right? The problem is no longer what the approach is. The problem is, getting the resources necessary to do it, or what have you. So the answer for me is heavily, I cannot be the expert on everything. I want to be. I love to think of myself as very smart. And I love to think of myself as, this crucial piece of my company. But that humility piece is my company will be a better company if it's not dependent on me and my personality. And so back to that point about what is a director? Well, my directors have their own budget. They can fill those work roles. I provide direction and guidance. I provide a lot of quality control. That's my role as the CEO. Ultimately, I'm the guy who's here talking to you. It's my face associated with the company. So that's really important. But if I had this moment at a previous job where I said to myself, because there was a hiring decision and they wanted, the company wanted them to hire this particular role. And the person who was the VP of that business unit was like, I don't need that role. They're like, but it's empty. And he's like, but I don't need it. I would rather reallocate those funds and hire these two other roles that I want. And I remember thinking, if they don't trust him, they should fire him and find someone else. And that really stuck with me. And so that's my perspective on a lot of those things is we focus on doing the hard work up front. We make sure that we're building the processes. And of course, in early days, sometimes you just have to sometimes you just, I had a friend who used to joke that the way he filled the refrigerator when he was unloading the groceries was to just close his eyes and push. So like Josh loading the refrigerator, sometimes you just have to close your eyes and push and make it work, but you never leave that as good enough. When we recognize, and that's again, ethics and humility, you say like, okay, I know this process isn't perfect. Well, you don't just let that propagate forever. You have to come back to it. And that's, you have to be humble enough to say this isn't perfect. You have to be ethical enough and consistent and professional enough to come back and fix it. And then, of course, trust the people. Say, like, you know what? I'm not the expert on this technology. Please go research this and tell me the correct answer. Or, I'm not great at finance. And that's why we have someone who's an expert on that who advises me on it. And then we make the best decision that we can. So
that's great to hear that.
I feel like I want to say humble a lot.
I think that's a good approach. I mean, the fact that you've been able to delegate so well and, trust the people that you hire. And that goes back to, very early on in the process, making sure you're hiring the right people, setting the expectations with them at the beginning. Like, look, I'm going to need to lean on you for these various tasks. So, when the rubber meets the road, I'm going to ask you to figure something out and, I'll trust you to do it. But not everybody is necessarily built to be autonomous in that way either, so especially for startups, I think often they require the self-starters that are able to kind of function on their own.
Well, and that comes back to the hiring is you're absolutely right. Early on, we had to hire a lot of very senior people because I needed Swiss Army knives early on. It's like, oh man, you might have to do, I don't know what your 80% thing is. My theory is that, every person has one thing that they spend 80% of their time on. And so that should be your hiring requirement. That's all you should ignore the other 20% like it doesn't exist. Which actually is advice that Warren Buffett gave when it came to marriage. A friend of mine heard him say that, you find somebody you agree with 80% of the time and forget the other 20%. But for hiring as well, like what are you spending 80% of your time on? Go find someone good at that. The rest we can sort out, and you can learn it. If they're the right kind of person, they'll step into the breach and help you solve those problems, or it can be shifted amongst people until you find a way that it shakes out effectively. But I'm sorry, with the when it comes to like building a company process, it's very easy to become dependent upon those Swiss Army knives. And so now you have this idea that that's what I have to hire. And that's why you saw us very intentionally trying early on in our corporate growth to say, no, we're going to go get junior people. Why? Because it's important that we break this mentality of hiring expensive, incredibly talented people to solve every problem. What we need to do is break down the problems, the challenges, the tasks, what have you, into their smallest pieces and solve them there, and kind of programmatically approach it rather than I've used this term before, that a lot of companies substitute excellence for process, that you just depend on one excellent person in lieu of a more robust process and possibly more durable process. And so then you have this individual dependency that exists. And again, departure becomes a much bigger risk to the corporation because you no longer have the process to support the departure of that person.
Single point of failure. Yeah,
that's exactly right. Yeah. So process, and again, there's nothing wrong with duct taping something while you're trying to get something work. 100-mile-an-hour tape is a real thing. They use them on airplanes because it's important. And there are times where you have to get this in the air or get this moving. But you cannot continue solving problems with, that aluminum tape that they put on planes. Like you can't hold it all together that way. So there's more to it than just that.
It's great that you're so focused on hiring juniors early on. And it would seem to me once you have kind of the blueprint, or you've created a blueprint for how to break down a role into its individual parts, to its most basic functions, to be able to split off some of those responsibilities and give them to somebody more junior. If you've done that once, you can probably replicate that process for other roles, other departments. I think, like you said, a lot of hiring teams will kind of get stuck in this cycle where they're just used to hiring super senior people. So that's what they default to. And they never really, I don't know. I don't want to speak poorly about hiring teams, that hire only senior people, but I don't think they think about how to actually, they don't have enough motivation, I guess, to break that role down into its component parts to hire somebody junior. when they see it as the most expedient way is just to hire, the senior person.
I'll tell you, I've seen Fortune 10 banks, and they can afford to hire the best of the best. And you know what? That sounds like a great way to run your business. If you're at that point and you have achieved that level of success and you've built the organizational efficiencies in so that, essentially you can fill these positions with very senior, very talented, very skilled people. Again, from a risk mitigation standpoint, that is a good approach. And so, I kind of look at them like, well, of course that's what they're doing. If I had, I don't want to say infinite budget, but if I had budget like that, of course that's what you go get the best person you possibly can. But you run the risk of you are, essentially you're fishing in a smaller pond at that point, and there are going to be opportunities that are missed as a consequence, or those opportunities will only come around in a couple of years when that opportunity is a lot more senior and a lot more expensive, and that's okay. That's a valid business approach. I don't have the luxury of that. There's a guy that I want to hire very bad. I just can't afford him right now, and I don't have the right role for him right now. And he knows it. I know it, and my CFO keeps a very close eye on the fact that he reminds me to make sure I know it. So that's okay. Like the business realities are what they are, but. So that means it gives me the opportunity, I would say, to go approach this differently. And I have this theory that every person should spend the most of their day doing the thing they're uniquely best at. And if you really want to say it in the business way, the thing they're uniquely best at that is the most profitable or the most expensive. And then their compensation follows that, again, back to that 80%. You spend 80% of your time doing this one thing, then your compensation should be in line with the value that thing brings to your organization. And I think that provides a lot of clarity in how you look at the task or the role or what have you. And in cybersecurity, that's messy because how much revenue does a host analyst bring to a bank? None. Okay, well, how much do they reduce their risk exposure, et cetera? And, what are they paying in insurance? And if you didn't have that role, what would you have to be paying? It's very hard. Don't get me wrong. For me, it's much easier. We're right now, we're doing a lot of building content, and I know what it costs per hour to build content. And if I can go find someone who can do this aspect of the job that was soaking up a lot of the time for one of my more senior people, it's why we're hiring junior red teamers and junior pen testers, because we're looking at it and we're saying, man, some of my more senior people are having these tasks eat up a lot of their day, and it means they're no longer doing the most of their day on the thing they're uniquely best at. Great. Let's go find someone who's uniquely best at the thing that's taking up that person's time. And then we shift that responsibility appropriately. And then we kind of bring everything back into balance that way. So that's how we approach it. And I recognize that that's not necessarily how everyone else approaches it. But I think it gives us a great opportunity to cast a wide net, to go find people who, might be outside of the realm. I might go find, there's a point in time where I actually envision starting to bring in data scientists to approach some of these visualization capabilities and building dashboards and doing some of the heavy lift data analytics that goes into cybersecurity with the guidance of one cybersecurity expert, then kind of infusing his expertise into the data analytics approach that makes up so much of what we do in cybersecurity. I recognize that's a weird approach, but I think it could be very, very beneficial. I think it could be lower cost, and I think we could get greater outcomes from that as well.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Streamline things to where people are focusing on the task that they're really good at, like you said, that 80%, and then just supplement the remaining 20% with somebody else that has a skill set that kind of fits in like a puzzle piece.
Right.
Kind of the way I see it. Well, that's a great point. We're coming up on time, so I got to ask you our one last question here. Is there anything that we're not talking about in the industry, but we should be, especially as it relates to hiring?
Especially as it relates to hiring. Oh man, I've got opinions on so many different things when it comes to our industry. But one of the things that I think needs improvement when it comes to hiring is something we already talked about, is that career progression. If you don't have a vision for how somebody enters your corporation at point X in their career, and it doesn't really matter. We talked about there's some companies that only hire people at the mid-level or what have you. That's fine. My question is, how do they transition from being a mid-level host analyst to a subject matter expert host analyst to maybe running part of the SOC? What does it look like to become a SOC manager? What does it look like to become a VP of cybersecurity, or maybe a deputy CISO, or do you say CISO or CISO?
CISO.
Okay, I realize it's like talking about religion at work, but that pronunciation. But what does that look like? Can I enter this company, stay for 30 years, and have a shot at becoming the CISO over time? And if you, as a company, can't answer that question, if you can't say yes, and this is what it looks like, then I would ask you the question: why would a person want to come to that company? And we know the answer. It's money, it's job stability, it's, all those sorts of things. But you should bear in mind that you've built a culture that involves departure being an aspect in career. And is that really what you want to achieve? And I think there are arguments to be made. I think there are definitely cases where a company might look at it and say, yes, I'm comfortable with that. I just think it should be a conscious decision rather than something that's just kind of anecdotal or happens through time without like it really being an examination and a conscious decision for an organization.
For sure, yeah. And some guests I've talked to, they plan in some attrition for their team because they know we don't live in a perfect world, and inevitably, with how competitive the field is, somebody's going to get some offer that they're not able to match in some aspect. But that's different, like you said, than just having no plan at all and just kind of flying by the seat of your pants. And if somebody does leave, it's a huge surprise. And then, if you do have that 6-month tail for hiring, what's that going to do to your existing team, as you had mentioned before? Well, that's a great place to end. Certainly appreciate your time, Pete. If people want to keep up with the work that you do, what's the best way to do so?
Easiest way to find us is, of course, on LinkedIn. We're Arbiter Security and Services. And, of course, our website, arbitersecurity.com.
Awesome. Thanks for your time, Pete. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, Pete.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Talent Gap Fireside Chat. Don't forget to follow our page on LinkedIn and like and subscribe on Spotify and YouTube. Hit that notification bell to be notified when we drop a new episode. New episodes air every Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern.